Hey everybody, today I'm going to be showing you a quick and totally inauthentic way to make carnitas. Now, traditionally these are braised in some sort of fat or lard, and they get this really soft texture on the inside, but kind of a nice crispy crust. So I'm going to be showing you how to get that same texture, just using a kind of unconventional braising liquid and then broiling them in the oven. So let's get started. Now the cut we're going to use for this is pork butt, which comes from the shoulder, don't be gross, but the reason that makes this perfect is because it's got a lot of fat and connective tissue that's going to help break down the meat and make it really tender. So if you can see any natural divides between the muscles here, definitely separate the meat at those creases, but mine was kind of one big chunk, so I'm just cutting it in half and then in half again. And here you can see a lot of that marbling with the fat that's going to give it a really nice texture. So after that we're just going to cut it into 2 or 3 inch chunks. And the actual size doesn't matter here, just make sure that all your pieces are the same size roughly so that they cook evenly. So you can just go ahead and chunk up the rest of that, and if you notice I've got a wet towel underneath my cutting board here. Now that's just going to stop it from slipping around so that you don't cut yourself. You might also notice I have a band-aid on my finger because the night before when I was making dinner I didn't do that. Alright, so after you've got your meat all chunked up and put into a bowl, we're going to add some seasoning to it. So we'll start off with a little bit of salt, some black pepper, this is some chili powder, some paprika, and we're going to add some cinnamon, but make sure you just add a tiny bit because this is really strong and you don't want your carnitas to end up tasting like a dessert or something. So next we're going to add some oil, and by adding the oil to the meat and mixing it with the spices, we're not going to add any oil to the pan when we're browning it. And this is going to stop there from being too much excess oil in the pan, which can burn your fond or any of the spices that come off the meat during the browning process. And of course, feel free to experiment with different spices here. Okay, garlic powder, onion powder, cumin, they all work really great. I just didn't happen to have any on hand at the time. Here I'm just adding a bit more oil because it was making more of a paste. It should have a bit looser texture, be a bit more shiny, and that way it's just going to make sure that the spices don't all burn off as soon as you put them in the hot pan. So you can just set those aside for a second, and before we start the browning process, we're going to get some aromatics ready to help flavor our braising liquid. So I'm just going to use some garlic cloves here, and we're just going to crush them up using the heel of your hand. You should never use a clenched fist like this, because your knife can slip and cut your hand. So because we're just adding these to the liquid to give it flavor, we don't need to cut them up or anything. You can just crush them and peel off the skins like this. And then we're going to move on to our next ingredient, which is admittedly not very traditional, but I think it's delicious. So we're going to go ahead and add some ginger. And of course you're welcome to use whatever kind of flavors you want in your braising liquid. You can add some anise star, you can add coriander, you can add cloves, whatever you think would work well in there. So I'm just going to go ahead and peel our ginger with a spoon, which you don't have to do as long as you wash it properly, but it only takes a couple seconds, so I'm going to do that. So then I'm just going to go ahead and slice it up into medallions, about the same size as our garlic cloves, but it's not incredibly important because it's going to be in that braising liquid so long that all the flavor is going to infuse anyways. So once those are ready, we're going to move on to our browning process, which we're going to do in batches so we don't overcrowd the pan and we can get a nice sear on them. So at about a medium high, we're going to start adding our meat, and if you don't hear this when you add it, then your pan is not hot enough. Now there are 2 factors at play here that are going to help give us a deeper, richer flavor. The first is called a fond, which is the word we use for all those caramelized juices and spices that are going to stick to the bottom of the pan. This is also the reason that we didn't add oil to the pan and that we're not cooking on high, because it's very easy for that to burn. The second is called the Maillard reaction, which is a chemical reaction that occurs between the amino acids and the sugars in a meat at a certain temperature and gives us that nice crust. So here I went to check if they were ready to turn, and you can see it's sticking. But don't panic, that's totally normal, it just means the meat isn't ready to release. Here just a bit later, you can see it releases rather easily, and you can get a close-up on that nice Maillard reaction we were talking about. Now this is another reason you don't want to cook it too high, because it's easy for that to burn as well, since we've got all our spices in there. And that tip for the meat sticking goes for any type of searing, whether it's in a pan or on the barbecue, and especially for the more delicate meats like chicken or fish. If you just wait, they'll release effortlessly and you'll be greeted with a nice crust like this. So after our first batch is ready, we're going to remove them from the pan to a plate and start on our second batch. And you're going to want to be careful about regulating your temperature here, since we don't want to burn this nice fond that we've accumulated. Now, you might think it's strange that we're focusing so much on the fond and the nice crust on the meat, since we're just going to be braising it, which is just a technique that means to slowly cook it in liquid to imbue it with flavor. But by focusing on those two factors, we're going to transfer that seared caramelized flavor into our braising liquid, which will slowly reintroduce it to the meat throughout the braising process. So here, as I'm finishing up my third batch, you can see a lot of the fat has rendered out, and if you can imagine about 100 times as much of that, that's the braising liquid we would be using in the traditional method. So after you take your meat out, we're going to throw in our aromatics just to give them a quick stir and wake up their flavors. Now this step isn't totally necessary, since like I said earlier, we're going to be braising them for so long the flavors will get there anyways, but it makes me feel like a fancy chef, and I like to think it helps anyways. So next, just transfer back in your meat, along with any accumulated juices. And you can see I didn't sear quite all of them, but as long as most of those sides have that nice crust, it's going to be fine. So now it's time for the big reveal. We're going to be using root beer as our braising liquid. Now that might seem kind of gross, and admittedly it kind of is, but I'd just like you to think of it as a professionally curated blend of sugars and spices in beverage form, which for our intents and purposes it is. So you're going to go ahead and add about half the can and stir it around to try and get all that fond dissolved off the bottom of the pan, which you can kind of see happening here. So after that, you can go ahead and just add the rest of your root beer, and don't worry, our final product is not going to taste like root beer. Okay, you're welcome to use any kind of soda you want, like Dr. Pepper or any kind of cola works great here, but we're really just looking for a way to add more flavor and, most importantly, sugar to our braising liquid. Alright, because sugar is what's going to help make the meat break down and become really, really tender. So after you've finished adding your beverage of choice, we're going to top it off with water, just to make sure that all of our meat is submerged during the braising process. After we've added that and given it a little stir to mix everything up, we're just going to bring it up to a simmer. And as you can see here, there might be some gross foam that starts coming to the top. Now you can skim that off if you want. I skimmed off just a little bit of it, but it's not going to make a huge difference after it's been braising for 2 hours. And so here we are about 2 hours later, and I'm just going to check the tenderness here with a fork. You can see that the meat has started to shrink up. And as you can see here, I'm just testing it by pushing it against the side of the pot. Now, it's still springing back and it's not breaking up, so we're not ready yet. Here we are another half hour later or so, and I'm just going to test it again. Now this is closer to what we're looking for. It should break apart pretty easily when you put pressure on it, and I wanted something a little softer, so I let this go about another 10 minutes, but you can see here we're pretty much there. So now I'm just doing this to show you sort of the texture on what I ended up with before we enter the final step here. You can see that it very easily falls apart under a fork. So now we're just going to transfer all this meat out into a pan or a roasting tray or sheet pan of some sort, really just something that you can put in the oven. And if you don't have a strainer like this that I'm using to put it into the pan, you can just dump out the liquid through a regular strainer, but you want to make sure to save a little bit of it, because we're going to add some to the pan as it's broiling. And if you're a little more meticulous than I am, you can pick out any of those garlic cloves or ginger medallions from your meat, but it doesn't bother me that much. So now we're just going to add some of the liquid to our meat, and that's going to make sure of a couple things. Number one, that nothing burns to the bottom of the pan as we're broiling it, and number two, we're just going to get a little more flavor out of it, because why would you not take every opportunity to get a little more flavor? At this point, we're also going to be getting our tortillas ready, because they're going to go in the oven first. Now, I was pretty inauthentic with the Carnitas, so we're going to go legit and use the most generic Mexican brand of corn tortilla I can find. In my experience, those are the best. Now, I find with corn tortillas, the thing that a lot of people don't like is the grainy texture they have, but if they're prepared properly, there's none of that. So I like to just wrap them very tightly in tin foil and then put them in the oven so that they steam and become very soft and pliable. So we're just going to throw those in the oven at about 400 degrees for something like 5 minutes. And once those are ready, you're going to want to turn your oven on to broil and then put the pan with carnitas on the top rack. And depending on the strength of your broiler, in about 5 minutes or so, you should have something like this. Now, as you can see, they have a really nice crust on them, but they still have that very soft, tender texture, which is exactly what we're going for. So these are ready to serve right away. So let's go ahead and check on our tortillas. Now be careful because the tin foil might not be hot, but there's going to be a lot of steam coming out of there when you open it up. And here you can see how soft and pliable they're going to be. So you can just cover those back up with the tin foil until you've got the rest of your taco fixins in order and are ready to plate up. So here I just plated them up with some guacamole, some chipotle mayo, pickled onions, and cilantro. Now traditionally, they're just served with some diced white onion and cilantro, I think, but we weren't very authentic with the rest of it, so why not add some interesting flavors? I hope you guys give this a try. Compared to the authentic method, it takes about half the time and 1/10 of the pork fat, and you still end up with something that's, at least for me, on par with my local taco shops. Thanks for watching the video, guys. If you want to see how to make the chipotle mayo or the pickled onions that I used on these tacos, be sure to check out these videos, and don't forget to subscribe if you want to see the new stuff that I've got coming out. And of course, as always, you're welcome to throw any requests for recipes or recommendations down in the comments.